Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. My husband and I treated ourselves to a night at Radisson Blu in downtown Chicago. We don't get to do things like that usually, so it was awesome. The rates were very inexpensive, and there were certain things that you had no access to, like a room service and the minibar, but we didn't care. Since there wasn't any room service, we ordered off Uber Eats. Nothing fancy, just potbellies. And I went downstairs and it's 10 p.m. to wait and smoke a cigarette. To be kind, I went around to the side, but still near the front. There was no one walking around, and I got the food, but I decided to finish smoking around the side. Suddenly, a really nicely dressed dude with a camo mask walked up and asked me for a cigarette. And normally that's not an issue, but he seemed a bit off. I can't explain it, except to say that as soon as he asked me, I felt like something was wrong. His voice sounded odd. When I gave him a cigarette, he got really close, then it started to get scary. He asked for some food. I felt bad, but it wasn't possible to give him food. It was 2 sandwiches, and I said that I was sorry, but it was for my husband and I. I figured that he would leave and I could finish smoking. But instead, he walked up so close that he was against the food bag, and I was against the other side, almost pressing the glass. Then he asked for some of the food again, and when I said no and that I'm really sorry, he insisted that I could, but I was just lying. He was getting angry, but he wasn't yelling, so as to not attract attention, I guess. And it continued like that for a few minutes. Then he asked to use my lighter. I gave it to him, and he started in on how I was lying again. He insisted that I could give him the food. Then he asked if I worked there, and I said that I was staying at the hotel. I was already really nervous. He asked where I was staying, and I asked why, and he said because there were a lot of hotels in the area. I pointed at the hotel behind me. I don't know why, but I was just really anxious by this point. This whole interaction so far was scary, and I usually have no issues dealing with people. However, he was getting pushier and angrier, and then he said, "So, you're staying here?" I said yes. And during this entire time, he kept saying that I was lying about the food. He started getting closer and closer to me as I backed up. He kept angrily insisting that I could give him food but didn't want to, and I said that no, that I am sorry that I can't. We were already too close for comfort and safe distances. He was pressing against the bag that I was holding against my chest, and his face was inches from mine. He then said, "So, you're here with your boyfriend?" I said husband, and I saw him check my hand. I started walking backwards to the back door, which was about 50 feet away. I thought that if I didn't act afraid, it would turn out better. But I was afraid. His cigarette was lit and he was still holding my lighter. People usually give it back at this point. He continued demanding some of the food, and I felt it was time to be more assertive, so I demanded my lighter back, and he started getting angry at me, saying over and over that I could give him some food. And he then gave my lighter back, but then grabbed both of my arms. I started getting terrified and banging on the glass door with my elbow to get the receptionist's attention, but she ignored me. He got pissed and said something, but I was so scared I wasn't even paying attention. I just wanted help. If anyone reading this knew me, they'd know that I'd never bang on a window yelling help unless I was absolutely terrified. I started crying because I was alone on a side street at night and no one could help me. I had no thoughts but to get away. I wasn't thinking he'd hurt me in a specific way. I just thought danger and run. That's how scared I was. He got angry that I was crying and then pulled me closer. Suddenly, something happened that changed everything, and I'm so grateful. My mother called. I had my earbuds in, which he couldn't see because my hood was up on my coat, so I pressed answer and I started crying hysterically and almost screaming. "He's trying to attack me! He's trying to attack me!" And that really angered him because he tightened his grip for a second, but also startled him, and he let go and I ran to the doors while still crying and shaking. I cried all the way back to my room, and my mom comforted me on the phone and told me not to go outside again. My husband was so comforting and sweet, and he just held me and then he wanted to know everything. I had to say it a few times because I was still crying and I couldn't breathe, plus I was talking fast. I saw him again at maybe 1 a.m., and I was standing in front of the hotel this time by those tall ashtray things that they have outside the restaurants and hotel. I wasn't alone though. A security guard was beside me, and I went inside and I saw him through the glass where he assaulted me. I don't know if he was waiting for me or what, but it terrified me. And that same night, another person asked for a cigarette, and it was a really nice woman. She thanked me, but she could tell that I was upset, I guess. She asked and I told her. She sympathized and explained that's why she carried a small handgun which was in her purse. I'm definitely getting mace, so this doesn't happen again. I'm 18 and female, and I just started a job at a hotel a little over a month ago as a housekeeper. The hotel is located in a very rural Midwest, so not a super busy hotel, except for the occasional family reunions checking in and the few workers passing through the state. Many of the people who come through are older, around 40s, 50s, and even upwards. And when I first started, my parents had told me to be careful because the hotel was sketchy. I never really found it to be sketchy or the people passing through to be, until one day about 2 weeks ago. I had just clocked in at around 10:30 and I headed down to the end of the hall, opposite of where the lobby was, to start on my stayovers. These are rooms where people stayed more than one night. At the end of the hall, there were 4 rooms tucked in to almost a corner, I want to say. You can't really see the doors to these rooms until you reach the end of the hallway. There's 2 rooms on one side and 2 on the other. I was grabbing all the supplies that I needed to do the stayover when a man, another stayover, came out of one of the 4 rooms and asked how to work the coffee machine. He was about 3 times the size of me, 6'3", around 300 pounds, whereas I'm 5'3" and about 125. It didn't seem like a big deal or weird, and I'm pretty friendly and outgoing, and I can make a little small talk. I went back to cleaning the other room and minding my business when he comes out again to tell me that his room didn't need attended to. I figured so, and I was just glad that there was another room that I could check off of my list. My manager had come down to the hall to strip a room that had checked out, and I turned down the hall to go strip another room when the man came out of his room again. I assumed he had another question about something in the room, so I turned around to speak to him. He asked, "Aren't you scared to do your job?" And I replied, "No, not really, since I rarely ever have any interaction with guests as a housekeeper." He then went on to say that I was awfully pretty and I needed mace or a weapon to protect myself. And I showed him my car keys that I kept in my pocket for that exact reason. The conversation at first wasn't really off-putting, but when I realized what he was getting at, my body flooded with anxiety. He then said, "I don't think car keys are enough. You're small and could get easily snatched up." And in that moment, I went into the room my manager was in, across the hall, and waited for him to go back into his room before continuing my job as normal as possible. That experience really shook me up, and I sat in another room down the hall for about an hour crying and having anxiety attacks because I thought that this man would try to find me in whatever room I was in and kidnap me. So, to the man who stayed in room 131 a few weeks ago, let's not meet. This happened in the summer of 2010 when I was just entering my teenage years. My family took a trip to a really nice hotel in the city. I can't really remember why we decided to take the trip, but I remember a lot of family and friends coming and staying in adjacent rooms. I've never asked my parents, and it's not really important to the story. To preface, I am a bit of a scaredy cat, and I always have been. I'm a pretty skinny, fragile kid, so I get spooked pretty easily even now. But this, however, was almost definitely not me freaking myself out like I normally did. And looking back, I'm incredibly lucky that I trusted my instincts. This hotel had a strange design to it. The lobby was actually on the 4th floor, not the bottom floor, which I found strange. And to access the lobby, you had to use the elevator. There was no way for you to get to it from the stairs. And this information would have been nice before everything happened, as you'll find out. The hotel was organized in a square shape. Every floor was lined with a balcony, and you could look out into the lobby and cafe area from your floor. Essentially, if you were walking to your room, you could be seen from anyone that was on your floor if they just stepped out of their room and looked around. I always was afraid that I'd fall over the balcony and sail down 8 stories to my death, but they were high enough to a point where I wasn't too concerned for my safety. The first day or two was nice. My friends and I hung out and played cards all day, or we watched whatever was on TV. And at night, we would explore the halls of the hotel and tell each other ghost stories. It was a really fun time, even though I didn't fully understand why we were there. But on the 3rd day though, things got strange fast. I woke up to the sound of screaming coming from outside my door. Now, because of the hotel's design that I mentioned, sounds from the lobby would echo all the way up to the top of the building. So, when I walked outside to investigate, I immediately looked over to the balcony to see what the commotion was about. I saw a girl laying on the ground, eggs and milk splattered everywhere around her, and people were rushing to help her, and I even heard a couple of people telling each other to call 911. It seemed like the girl was unconscious, and maybe she had passed out or something, and I scanned the lobby and saw that my family and a couple of my friends were in the lobby getting breakfast, all staring at the event in front of them. So I decided that I'd rush down to meet them to find out what had happened. The elevator was on the opposite side of my floor, so I took the stairwell located right next to my room. We were on the 7th or 8th floor, so I knew that I only had to take about 4 flights down. Not really a big deal. I descended for a little while, looking for the number 4 on the wall, or the letter L. I passed floor 5 ready to find a door to the lobby, and I took about 2 more flights of steps before realizing that there hadn't been a door for the 4th floor, nor had there been a door for the 3rd or 2nd. Now, at this point I probably should have turned back, but I continued down because I was tired and I didn't want to climb back up. There were some weird side halls that went into pitch black areas with a bunch of piping and wiring, and though I was curious to explore, I just passed them by. I quickly hit the bottom floor, a dimly lit and cold room with cinder block walls and concrete floors. In front of me was a set of double doors, and I hesitated at first, but I assumed that this was just another way back to the lobby, so I opened them and entered. Behind the doors was a massive warehouse-type room, probably the size of a smaller basketball stadium, and the only light coming in was from the stairwell behind me, so I really wasn't able to see much. Stairs were stacked and covered in plastic wrap, tables lined the wall, and in the distance, I thought I could see boxes stacked and lined against the wall as well. I was probably in the storage room for the hotel, and I looked around and saw an elevator in the back of the room, so I made my way towards it. I closed the door to the stairwell and I began to walk in the dim light. The room was super muggy and dusty, and it seemed like nobody had been down there in a long time. As I got closer to the elevator, I noticed that it was a little bigger than the elevators in the lobby and on the other floors. I pressed the up button, but I got no response. There was a card swiper next to the button, and it must have been for employees only, I thought. I turned back towards the stairwell doors, making my way past the chairs and tables along the wall. And when I got to the door, I gave it a tug. Locked. Of course. This is when things started to hit me, and I realized that I was stuck in the dark, dusty basement of a hotel. I didn't have a phone because my parents wouldn't let me get one until I graduated middle school, so I couldn't call anyone. Everyone likely assumed that I was still asleep in my room, so I began to freak out, believing that nobody was going to look for me. I searched around the warehouse looking for other ways out. Some areas of the place were better lit than the others, so I looked around in areas that I could see first before starting on the darker side of the room. There was one other set of doors that I found, but it happened to be locked as well. And I began to cry, scared that nobody would ever find me in the basement. I swear, it felt like hours, but I think only a handful of minutes passed before I heard the door creak open. It wasn't the door from the stairwell, rather, the second door that I had found. A slim middle-aged man in a lab coat came out of the doors. Now, if this was 21-year-old me, seeing this man, I would be very confused as to why this guy was wearing a lab coat in a hotel. I was only 12 or 13 at that time, so I immediately was relieved at the sight of an adult who looked smart. I approached him, tears in my eyes, and he immediately looked surprised to see me, as you'd expect. "What are you doing here?" he yelled. "I got lost on my way down to the lobby, and I've been locked in here. Do you have a key?" I was shaking, eager to get out of there. He didn't answer my key question, and instead he said, "I know a way out of here. Follow me." He began to walk towards the doors with the stairwell, and I followed, relieved that someone had finally come to save me. We approached the doors and I began to reach for the handle, but he continued walking. "Isn't it right here?" I asked him. I will never forget the look on his face when I said that. He looked nervous, and though it was dim, I could see sweat glistening from his forehead and behind his glasses. "No, this way," he said sternly. I continued to follow him, but I was now nervous myself. We had passed the door to the stairs and we are now headed toward the darker side of the basement, away from the elevators. He looked like he had no clue where he was leading me, and as he kept checking around him, almost as if he was taking in his surroundings for the first time. We turned a corner and began walking towards the boxes. A dead end. I immediately froze, realizing that something was very, very wrong. This guy had no idea where he was going, nor did he appear to work at the hotel. I said with my voice shaking, "Okay, where are we going?" He turned and said, "This way, just follow me." And I knew that there were no doors by those boxes. I had checked there first after I found out the stairwell door was locked. I want to thank whatever God is up there for gifting me with the idea that I had next. I started yelling, as loud as I could. I yelled so loud that I gave myself a headache, and the man, irritated and plugging his ears, began yelling back at me. "What are you doing? Be quiet!" But I continued to yell. I don't even remember how long I was yelling. And finally, the man snapped and began quickly walking towards me. I went in a full sprint towards the stairwell doors, hoping to God that they'd somehow be magically open. He didn't run after me. He walked sternly behind me, muttering things like, "Stupid kid," and other kind compliments. I was about 5 feet from the door when somebody burst through. My savior. A hotel janitor who had heard the screaming from the stairwell. He saw the situation, me, and some random guy in a lab coat in a locked basement, and immediately told me to get behind him. The janitor asked me who the man was, and I said I had no idea, that he had come in through the door on the other side of the room, and I pointed the door. The janitor quickly radioed into the desk that he had found a child in the basement, and quietly, so that I wouldn't hear that, he said, "This man came from outside, get security," or something like that. The man in the lab coat started trying to argue with the janitor, claiming that he was simply looking for a bathroom. The janitor clearly wasn't buying it and kept saying things like, "Wait till security gets here and talk to them about it." And I was standing beside him the whole time, trying to take in what was happening, confused out of my mind. Eventually, an employee from the front desk arrived and took me back up the steps to the lobby where I met with my family, who surprisingly had no idea that I was missing. I told them the story, crying and shaking, and they hugged me tightly, thanking the employee over and over for their help. But I never got to thank the janitor though. Looking back now, I have absolutely no clue what that man was doing in the basement. I don't have any information as to what happened afterwards or who he was. I know for a fact that the incident with the girl in the lobby was unrelated. Something about low blood sugar or something. I'm not sure. I've thought about that day a lot, and the only explanation I can put together is that the door that I had found in the basement led to the streets of the city where he must have wandered in from. I have no clue what his intentions were and why he was wearing a lab coat or why he chose to pretend to know a way out. To be frank, this could have just been a huge misunderstanding of some sort, and I just chose a really bad time to get lost. But all I know for sure is if I hadn't screamed my lungs out, I might not have been telling the story the same way, or at all. So strange man in a lab coat wandering around a dark, dusty hotel basement. Let's not meet.
So, I've been a bit down on my luck as of late, and unfortunately have had to move out of my apartment due to the building being shut down because there was a major issue. I don't know the whole story, but I think it had something to do with mold in the inner walls or something. Basically, we were kicked out and told we could come back eventually, but there's been no updates for about a week. It's incredibly stressful not being able to be in your own home because of things out of your control, and to not know if you'll be told that you can come back and to just get your stuff really sucks. Thankfully, because this was an issue with the property and was not my doing, nor the fault of anyone that lives there, The rental company has to cover our living expenses until they get everything sorted out. However, they also have the ability to restrict where they are willing to let us stay, and they chose a hotel that is an extended stay type of place in a rather mediocre part of town. Now, I don't want to complain about a free living space, but this place needs some major TLC. The first thing that I noticed when I went to check in was that the main lobby's carpet was horrifically dirty, like stained multiple colors and fraying at most of the edges, kind of dirty, and the TV in the lobby was a thick CRT style TV that was really small. I know I sound like I'm complaining, but it's just one of those things that in 2022, if you see a CRT TV in the lobby of a hotel, it kind of speaks to the quality of the overall hotel. Some people will disagree with that, and that's fine, but that's just my opinion. Anyways, I checked in and got my key to my room, which was room 203. I got to the room and went in, and it was nothing special. It was a pretty bland and plain single bedroom, and that was fine. As wary as I was of the hotel, I was still happy that I had a place to sleep and that I didn't have to pay for it. Honestly, it was decent here for the most part for the first couple weeks, until one night in the second week, I got a phone call to my room. I answered it because it was kind of weird, and I assumed it was the front desk because who else would have the direct number to my room? I say hello, and the person on the other end says, "Hi, this is Howard from the front desk. There was an issue with your payment and we need you to come down to the front desk to clear it up. Shouldn't take but a moment or two." I mentioned that I wasn't the one paying for the room and that it was being paid for by my apartment complex. And after a moment, the guy said, well, if you could just come down here, I'll get your info and we'll get this squared away." Obviously, I was annoyed, but just said okay and that I'd be down in a moment. I grabbed my wallet and phone and went to the elevator and then went down to the main lobby. I got down to the desk and the same woman that had checked me in 2 weeks ago was working. I mentioned to her that I got a call from someone at the front desk saying that there was an issue with my payment. She kind of looked at me confused and mentioned that she was the only person working the front desk that night and that she wasn't aware of any issues. I asked her if there was anyone named Howard that worked there, as that was who called my room, and she told me that there wasn't. After a few more moments of her checking my booking and making sure that everything was okay with everything, I thanked her and mentioned that it must have just been a prank caller or something. She agreed, but told me to come back and tell her if it happens again or if there are any other issues. I went back up to the second floor and went over to my room, and as soon as I entered, I realized what had happened. I got in and my suitcase with all my clothes was gone. When I went downstairs, it was sitting on the chair in the corner, as I always do, and when I got back, it was just gone. I immediately called the front desk and told her that my room had been robbed, that someone had broken in while I was downstairs and stolen my items. She was a bit confused on how that could have happened since I was the only person that should have had a key to the room, but she said she would call the police and would send one of the hotel staff up to the room right away. I just sat there, honestly feeling violated, like I should have realized something was up, because there was no way something would have just been wrong with my payment, as I wasn't the only tenant staying here. I should have asked more questions and pressed the guy, and I would have realized it was BS, but hindsight is 2020. After a few minutes, I had a knock on my door from one of the hotel staff, and then the police showed up. I explained what happened to all of them. I told them that I had gotten a call on the phone saying there was an issue I needed to come downstairs for, and I fell for it. I then said that when I got back into the room, my stuff was gone. The police asked me if I was the only one that had a key to my room, and I told them I was. And the staff member mentioned that the only people that could get into the rooms were the customer that rented it and the cleaning crew. It was at that point that one of the officers asked if they had cameras in the hallways, and they confirmed they did. I'm not going to get into the specific details of all that happened, but they checked the security camera and they did see someone enter my room. Sure enough, he used a cleaning crew key to get in. It was a different color than the normal room key, and even the staff confirmed that it was a staff key. Even worse, the front desk knew exactly who it was that was on the camera stealing my stuff. It was another tenant of the building that I lived in. It was seriously someone else that was in the same situation as me. They had decided that they would take the time that they were stuck in this hotel to steal a key from a staff member and rob the other people staying there. I think he was surprised when I mentioned that I was there from the apartment complex, because I think he was targeting other people, but he still saw opportunity and took it. After the front desk confirmed who he was, the officers went up and checked out his room, and long story short, he was arrested. He'd mostly stolen small things from people while he was there, but when he got to my room, there was nothing sitting out except my suitcase full of my clothing. So he just snatched the whole thing and ran. Hence why I was the first to complain about this. I was the first to notice. In the end, he was arrested and I got my stuff back. And I am actually, as of the time of writing this, still staying in this hotel, mostly because I don't have much of a choice. There haven't been any more issues, thankfully, but I'm kind of paranoid now about everything I hear in the hallway, thinking it's going to be someone breaking in. I know that's dumb, but it's just a response to having my temporary home violated like that. Hopefully I get to move back into my apartment soon. Like, hopefully by the new year soon, but I'm not holding my breath.
I was working as a hotel maid in my late teens. I would go around and clean rooms that the guests had just left, and then start cleaning rooms of those guests who were staying 2+ nights. Usually, I cleaned their bathrooms, bring in fresh towels, empty the trash, and even sometimes vacuum. So, we had this one man who was at this point what we call a regular. He would stay at the hotel for 5 to 6 weeks at a time, and he would almost always be in his room, and nobody knew what he was ever up to. But he always looked shabby, looked like he never had enough sleep in his room, and had this lingering heavy smell. He was reeking of alcohol and smoke, but usually the mixture of both. But I had not seen him smoke or even seen cigarettes or alcohol in his room. I got weird vibes from him, so I would always leave the door open if I was in the room and he was there with me. I usually would put the trash can against the door and leave it like that until I am done and gone. So, one day like any other day, I knocked on the door saying, "Housekeeping," and I heard him say, "All good, come in." I entered and put the dirty towels in my basket and began cleaning the bathroom. He almost always had lots and lots of trash, which usually included junk food, an inexcusable number of soda bottles. I proceed to change his beds, and he sat in the recliner watching me the entire time. No small talk, nothing. I grew more uncomfortable, but then he got up, moved the trash can and closed the door. I immediately moved from in between the bed and the wall and sheepishly said that I forgot the fresh towels. He was leaning against the wall with one arm at that point and shaking his head. I said, "I need to get you some towels." Kind of pushed him out of the way and then ran out of the door as fast as I could. And I never cleaned that room again after that incident. A long time ago, I was a single mother with a young boy about 7 years old, and I was doing my best to make ends meet with what little money I could scrape together working part-time. We didn't live in the best home, but I did everything that I could to keep him happy, healthy, and fed, and I like to believe that I did a damn good job. I can say that nowadays, things are much better. He's grown, I'm in a new marriage, and honestly, life is much happier. That said, there were times where I made mistakes and where things got really rough. And this is actually about an event where the unthinkable could have happened, and I really shouldn't have brought him with me, but I'm actually glad that I had. Though, I will say that my decisions weren't the worst part. I thought things were okay. I just trusted someone a bit more than I should have. So this was back when my son and I had just moved into a new apartment when he was about 7 or 8 at the most. My husband and I had been divorced for a year, and I was just really getting out into the world after losing the house. There's a long story there that we won't get into. I was working part-time, so I didn't have a lot of money, but I had a family member that was helping me with the rent for the time being, so it wasn't a huge deal. However, after having lived with them for a year and then moving into my own apartment, I realized how much I was actually missing to be self-sufficient. One of the big things I was missing was a vacuum. Vacuums are the one thing that you never think about, and when you realize you don't have one, and then go look for a good one, you come to the conclusion that they are rather expensive. So in a moment of genius, I went out to Craigslist to see if I could find a cheap secondhand vacuum that was at least decent quality. In my mind, if I could find one that I could use and keep for a year at most, I would most likely be able to get the money together to get a good one that was new. And as such, I went for a mid-low price tier when searching. I ended up finding one that I liked, and the person only wanted $20 for the vacuum. I contacted him, everything seemed reasonable, and honestly, I didn't even get any red flags when myself and this person sent messages back and forth about everything. Everything about this transaction seems like it was going to be ideal. Like, I would just bring the $20 and he would give me a vacuum and that would be it. Of course, one of the dumb decisions I did make was being willing to meet this guy at his house instead of a public place. I will admit that I was a bit naive back then, and I hadn't done many transactions online, and I thought that it would be just a 5-minute thing. On that following Sunday, I started heading toward the address that he gave me, and I sent a message saying that I was on my way. I pulled up to the house, and there was a man standing outside on the front porch holding a glass of iced tea, just kind of watching me as I pulled up. I got out of the car and my son followed pretty closely behind me. I thought about telling him to stay in the car, but I kind of thought that would be a worse idea than in a strange place. And as I approached, the man on the porch asked if I was my name, and I said I was. He turned and opened the door and mentioned that I could step in the entryway and that he would go get the vacuum for me. We stepped just inside the door, and the man went over toward the other end of the house and into a bedroom. As he was out of my sight, he kind of started making small talk about the vacuum, saying it was still good and that he has just changed the belt on it, and he apologized that he had lost one of the attachments. After this, he, out of seemingly nowhere, asked if I was a Christian. I mentioned that I was, and because I was taken aback, I asked why that was relevant. He followed it up with, "I was just asking, sorry if I pulled you away from church to do this sale." He came out of the room with a vacuum, and he then continued, "I'm pretty devoted to my faith myself, so I know how important it is to go to church. Do you go to church?" It was a bit weird, but I thought that maybe this man was just really religious, so I mentioned that we hadn't lately because we had just moved and I hadn't found one in the area to attend. He smiled and nodded, like he understood. But then it got weirder, he said. And this is a direct quote because I will never forget his words. "You know, God told me that you would be coming alone, and that if you did, I should take you as mine and run away into the desert." I just sort of stared at him like, "What the hell is wrong with you?" He laughed, and then he said, "But you didn't come alone. You came with your son. I think he was testing me, and this was his way of making sure I'm faithful." I was ready to run out of that house, but I was also afraid that if I did, he would do something. After what was probably 2 or 3 minutes of panic-filled silence, he just kind of pushes the vacuum towards me and says, "Here, you can have it. I don't need the money." I grabbed it and just sort of turned away to leave. The entire time we were walking toward my car, this man was seriously saying some prayer, one that I didn't know, so I don't think it was a real one. I pulled away and drove out of that neighborhood faster than I should have. Thankfully, my son just kind of thought that he was weird, and it didn't really click that we were in the presence of an absolute psychopath. I just kind of laughed and said, "Yeah, he was a bit weird, huh?" And thanked my lucky star that he decided that my son was a reason to not hurt me. That was one of the only times that I ever did any deals off of Craigslist, and it was the only time that I ever did one at someone's house. After that, it was always a store parking lot or other public places. I will also mention that I blocked his number after that, as he did try to text me one more time asking if I wanted to go to his church. I responded with no thanks and then blocked him. Thankfully, the vacuum did work, so I guess that's a plus. So my fiancé and I have been on the lookout for a kitten to accompany our 3-month-old kitten that we already have. We searched and searched until one day he said to me, "Let's look on Craigslist." And so I did. We found the perfect one, but the only problem was it was 2 hours and 30 minutes away from our home. I inquired about it at around 10:30 p.m. I know it was late, but I almost immediately got a response. She sounded very nice over text and asked to see where I lived so that she would feel settled about the kitten living with us. She also insisted on going to their house. I know, I should have just dropped it, but at that time I thought nothing of it. So I sent them a video and we sent up a time for the next day to meet. The next day came and I wasn't going to take my fiancé, but he insisted on coming with me because he wanted to be my protection in case, since Craigslist is sketchy. So we drove 2 hours and 30 minutes on our way there. And as we were on our way, I was texting this girl that we would get there on time, and she responded with, "Great, see you then." And we arrived to the home, me in the driver's seat, and my fiancé in the passenger seat with the window down. I texted the girl and I got no response. I called and I got no response too. I ended up calling 5 times and texting in the course of an hour, and there was no response. I went up to the house and knocked on the door, but nothing. There was a car in the driveway, but no response from the number or the door. We got there at 6:30 and we waited until almost 8, but nothing. The neighbor came out asking what was wrong, and I said I'm here since I inquired about a kitten, and she said, "A kitten?" I said, "Yes, it was an ad on Craigslist." And she said, "No one has kittens in this home though." I showed her the ad and she said, "Oh, I know them. They're very sketchy people and they don't own any cats. I just helped them move their furniture yesterday." So I said, "Well, on their ad it says that they have to get rid of their kittens since their new place doesn't allow pets." And then the neighbor answered, "That's impossible. I have a dog and so does the next door over." I immediately found this creepy and assumed the neighbor was also in on something since it was too creepy and I was feeling anxious. I thanked her and I left along with my fiancé. Literally immediately when we pulled out of the street, I got a text from the girl saying, "I'm just now getting your messages. Something must be wrong with my phone. Do you still want the kitten or no?" And I didn't answer and we headed back home. What I don't understand is, they didn't get any money from me, but they asked me to show up not knowing that I'd be with my fiancé. I had a bad feeling about it. What did they want from me? A few years ago, I moved with my family right before I started college. Unfortunately, it was kind of far from the university that I had been accepted into, so I had been trying to find a place to rent close to my university. My dad helped me and showed me an ad on Craigslist. There was a nice looking house for rent and it was close to my university. I decided to set up a meeting to go check out the place. I showed up in the afternoon and unfortunately I was alone. My dad said that I was an adult and a big guy, so I shouldn't worry about meeting this person. This old guy greeted me and then goes, "You'll have to follow me to get to the house for rent." I was confused and I said, "Your ad said that this was the house for rent. Why do I have to go somewhere else?" He says, "This is my house. I'll take you to the one that's for rent." I'm a little concerned at this point and I followed him to his other place. I figured that if things didn't look right, I'd just leave. We get there and I noticed that this house looks bad and it looked like people were in it. I didn't see any other cars around, so this seemed odd. He looks at me and says, "Don't you want to check it out?" I said, "I don't know. This isn't what was in your ad and it looks like other people are there." He tells me that other people are checking it out and I could just join them. Something just felt weird about the whole thing and I told him that I wasn't interested anymore. This place looked in a bad shape from the outside and appeared to have people in the house. When he asked me why I wasn't interested, I told him that it was too far of a drive for school and work. He got mad at me and accused me of wasting his time. I said, "Well, I'm not the one advertising a house and then telling the person it's not the one for rent." He began to glance nervously towards the house and asked if I was sure that I didn't want to check it out. Well, I told him no and then left. He never contacted me again, thankfully. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but something just felt wrong. Maybe he was just trying to show me the house, but I didn't like that he lied about the house to begin with, and that there were other people inside the house. I'm not sure what was going on there, but I didn't really want to find out. I also didn't like how he kept looking at the house when he was asking if I was sure I didn't want to check it out. It seemed so bizarre how he went from being mad at me to getting kind of desperate for me to go inside. A while back when I hit 19, I kind of ended up in a situation where I wanted to get out of my house and get my own place, mostly because I was tired of living with my parents. It was more that I was tired of living by others' rules. I love my parents dearly, I really do, but they were also pretty strict with things, and it was definitely holding back my social life. I'm kind of a free spirit, and I like to be out socializing, but they wanted me home by 8 every night. And that's not me complaining, it's their house, their rules and all. But it was enough to make me realize that I could just move out and get a cheap place nearby, keep them close, and make sure that I had my freedom. So, that's what I decided I was going to do. After looking around for a while, I actually found a decent apartment that I could afford with my job that was less than 10 minutes away from where my parents lived. I went through all the motions to get the apartment, paid the deposit, and then got it. Moving day came, and my parents helped me get everything in and set up, and it was at that point that I realized that I didn't have a whole lot, and definitely didn't have enough to fill an apartment. My bedroom had my bed, my desk, dresser, and my living room had a table with a TV on it, and that was pretty much it. I started talking to my dad about it and trying to figure out the list of things that I needed for the apartment or what I could use. And my dad made a suggestion that I should look for cheap furniture on Craigslist. We talked about it for a bit, and he actually mentioned that if I found some stuff for the apartment on Craigslist that would work for me and wasn't terribly expensive, he would go in on half and go with me to get it all. I thought this was a good idea. He had a truck, plus having him with me would make me feel a whole lot safer in dealing with strangers. So I agreed. I told him that I would look online and get a hold of a few people over the next couple weeks, and we would meet up when I had everything ready to go. So I did just that. I got on Craigslist, and I went through a number of postings. I sent a few emails. Some responses I got were obvious scams or bots, so I just ignored those. I had a few people that were interested in selling to me at first, but ended up disregarding me after I told them that it was going to be almost 2 weeks before I could pick it up. Apparently, they weren't willing to wait to sell it, which was fine by me. And after sifting and sending, I was actually able to get a few people that were willing to hold on to their items for me, so at least it wasn't a waste of time. Then, I found a post that was more or less furniture, men's clothing, electronics, and more. I want it all gone, $200. I clicked through the pictures that this person had posted, and looking through it, they were selling a lot of things for such a low price. There were a number of furniture items, a couple game consoles, a decent desktop computer, and then clicking through it, I noticed that some clothes were mostly my size. I was over the moon, thinking that I had hit a jackpot. Sure, it seemed a bit sketchy, but at the same time, if this was legit, I would have furnished my whole place and had a bunch of what would basically be luxury items for only $200. The post had a phone number on it, so I immediately grabbed my cell and called the person. I mentioned the post, and I asked the woman that had answered why she was selling things for so cheap, because it did seem a bit odd. She then said that she and her boyfriend had split up, and that she hadn't seen him for weeks at this point, and all the items she wanted gone were his. She even sent me a few pictures of herself in front of all the items while we were talking to prove that it was all real. I told her that I would give her the asking price for it if she could hold on to it for 2 days, as it was Thursday before we were supposed to go get the items, and that I would take every single item off of her hands that she wanted to sell. She actually agreed, and she mentioned that I was the first person to call and said that she would go ahead and mark it as sold. I was obviously over the moon. I had just struck Craigslist gold. I called my dad and told him that this lady had a bunch of items that she wanted to get rid of just for $200. And he seemed a bit concerned at first. I explained the situation, mentioned that she had sent me proof that it was all real, and then told him that it was left over from a bad breakup and that the boyfriend hadn't come back for it. It took a bit of extra convincing, but I was able to finally get him to go with it. Saturday morning comes, and I text the woman, mentioning that we would be there within the hour. She responded with an okay, and that was it. Not really the best response, but it was enough for me. We headed to the house, and I was feeling even better about this transaction. The house was nice, like multi-story and well taken care of, so she could afford to just get rid of these things for way under retail value, kind of nice. We pull into the driveway, walk up to the door, and I ring the doorbell. Nothing. No response. We waited for a little while, but after a couple of minutes with no response, I rang the doorbell again. And still, no answer. I pulled up the initial messages between the two of us to make absolutely sure that this was the address, and it definitely was. I then decided to go ahead and give her a call, and when I did, I could hear the phone ringing inside the house, like just on the other side of the door. I actually glanced over toward the window by the door and started looking inside. My dad chastised me at first, saying that I was being rude, but I had this really weird feeling that something was off. This was a nice house. The woman I spoke with was friendly and seemed like she really was wanting to get rid of these items, and I was really wanting to get the stuff she was selling. Then, I realized why I was feeling off about the whole thing and what I was actually seeing. There was someone lying on the floor just inside the door. I mentioned it to my dad, saying that I think something had happened to the lady. He came over and looked in, and then told me to call 911. And I could tell by his tone that he realized something was definitely wrong. I called them, and I explained the situation to the person on the other end. It was a bit weird having to tell them that we had no idea who this person was, that we were just here to buy stuff, and then tell her that there was a person unconscious on the floor inside the house. It was just as awkward trying to explain it to the first cop that pulled up to the house as well, but I think they understood it better than the dispatcher. And sure enough, the officer agreed that there was a person unconscious in the house, and then decided that that was cause enough to kick the door in and call the medics. They obviously kept us out in the driveway, and we had to answer a lot of questions about why we were here and how we were connected to what was now a crime scene. And after the medics show up, the potential crime scene became a confirmed crime scene. And it became pretty clear how serious this really was. The long short of it, the woman was deceased, and based on how the officer explained it, it was an obvious homicide. Thankfully, I had all the text messages and screenshots of the post to help show that we weren't the one who killed her, but I was also able to explain to them that she had told me about her ex and how they had split up. They ended up taking my information and telling me that they would be in touch with me if they had more questions, and we had to leave at that point. They never called me back or asked me to come in at all. I don't know if they ever ended up solving the case, but it definitely seems like this was a situation where the ex-boyfriend came back and then did the unthinkable. What makes it worse? Part of me still thinks that he may have done it because she was selling his stuff, and that if I hadn't set up the meeting to pick it all up, he may not have done it. But if it weren't me, then someone else would have just jumped on the deal. I don't let it tear me up, but it does bother me a little. I did end up getting a couch for my living room from another seller and also a few other things. But that was the only time that I ever used Craigslist. I know, it's not a common thing to happen, but I didn't want to ever be put in a situation like that again. About 2 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. The walls were very thin, and because of the fire safety laws in my city, my bedroom had one window, which led into the living room, and none with outside access. The window will be important later. It was 3 bedrooms, one for me, one for the master tenant, and one spare, which at that time was rented out by a pretty friendly guy. Well, a friendly guy had issues with his work visa and had to move back to Canada last minute, leaving us about 2 weeks to find another roommate. Our quickest and easiest option was Craigslist. Due to my work schedule, I had no part in the selection process, but I was content with the new roommate moved in a little later. He seemed a bit off, but friendly. He was a very tall, large guy, but pretty quiet, and not someone I wanted to go out of my way to hang out with, but was okay to be around and be cordial with. About 2 weeks into his move-in, the master tenant left for Hawaii, leaving him and I alone in the home for the month-long duration of his stay. For the first few days, things are normal. But all of a sudden, about 4 days into the trip, I am woken up at about 8 a.m. to a frantic knocking at my door. A roommate, we'll call him Kyle, is standing there when I open up, looking frazzled. He looks me dead in the eye and says, "So, do you want to tell me what went on last night?" To which I was shocked and confused because I had come home from work at about 9 p.m. and I immediately showered and went to bed. I explained this to him, and he tells me that he heard me screaming and arguing with someone in my room, and that he saw me in the side alley out the window arguing with our landlord, whom I've never even seen at this point. And he also said that he heard people coming in and out of our house. I tell him no way, none of that ever happened. And after staring at me for a little longer, he leaves and doesn't bring it up again. The next morning, I wake up to the same thing. This time, he says he saw me arguing with my boyfriend. I was single at that time, and he said that he had seen me talking with our other roommate who's in Hawaii and asking me for the badge number of the officer I'd spoken to, since he had apparently seen me talking to a bunch of police as well. This time, I get angry and more or less tell him to cut this shit out because I'm not doing anything and don't know what he's talking about. He gets a weird look on his face and says, "I think I had a seizure in my sleep. The next time it happens, call an ambulance," and leaves for a bit, only to start knocking again about an hour later. And when I open up, Kyle repeats the exact same story verbatim. This happens once more before I tell him to leave me the fuck alone and leave for work. I go to work as normal, and I am reluctant to return that night, but I am too tired to switch to an alternate location. Well, big mistake. About 1 a.m., I wake up to slamming doors. Kyle is pacing back and forth between his bedroom, the living room, and out the front door, walking in and out of each room, turning the lights on and off, mumbling angrily and slamming the doors. I can see his figure pacing back and forth through the frosted window in my room that leads to the living room. And since my room is dark, he can't see inside. Suddenly he screams, "I can't live like this! Why are you doing this to me?" I think he's on the phone and I don't respond. A few moments later, he screams my name repeatedly and I realize that he's directing it towards me. I knew I had to get the fuck out of there. So I very quietly creep out of bed and start getting dressed and packing a bag of clothes for work in the morning. I'm almost done when he screams, "I hear you!" and charges over to my room, slapping the wall next to my door but not touching the door itself. I look towards my window and see his shadow lean all the way forward, pressing his ear against the glass. I was freaking terrified and I sat completely still, unmoving. He eventually screams my name again and moves away from the window, and I hear him start pacing between rooms again. Now, my shoes are kept on a rack outside my door and not inside my room, so I know that when I leave, I'm going to need a moment to put them on. I decide to wait until his pacing takes him out of the front door again, at which time I plan to grab my shoes, put them on, and run. And as I'm formulating this plan, the pacing stops. He screams, "Do you want to fucking fight about this? Come out right now, and we'll fight, I swear to God." I'm very small, I'm a 5-foot girl, and this guy is easily 3 times my size, so I am definitely not looking to fight. Thanks. And after a few minutes, he turns off all the lights, and I hear the door to his room open and close, followed by silence. I wait for a moment to be sure, and I can't hear any movement, and then I decide to take my chance. I took a breath and pulled my door open quickly. I step out and grab my shoes before I look up a second later and see him standing shirtless with just a pair of boxers and socks on in the dark of the hallway. His arms hung slightly outward in an awkward position, and he says in a low, calm voice, "Ma'am, we need to talk." That was a hard no for me, so I grab my shoes and run out of the door with them in hand. I ran about a half block barefoot before I stopped to put them on, and when I look back, he is standing in the porch light of our front door, watching me run but not moving. Luckily, I had a friend who lived 2 blocks away and I had their spare key, so I let myself in and crashed there for the night. And that's where I stayed for the next week or so while we worked things out with the master tenant, and Kyle agreed to move out within the week. He says he doesn't remember anything that happened or wasn't sure if it was real or not, but if I said that's what went down, then it must be real. The day Kyle left, he sends a photo of the house key sitting on the table and says, "I'm out," and nothing else. I take a friend over there with me to scout it and ensure that he has actually left. When we got there, we discovered that not only had he left a ton of food and furniture, but he had ripped all of the fire alarms out of the ceilings. He had unscrewed and removed the deadbolt to the front door and left them lined up neatly on the front table. We then realized that my front door can only lock by using a key from the outside, and it had been locked when we arrived, meaning Kyle still had a key. So we called the locksmith immediately. But even after changing the locks, I was still terrified to stay there alone afterwards, and never went to sleep at night without barricading the doors with chairs and other furniture. To this day, I still fear for his safety. He was obviously psychologically unstable, but I also wonder what could have happened if I hadn't been as lucky as I was. I've been the man behind the bar for a significant portion of my life, mostly because it pays the bills, lets me work odd hours of the day, and you get to meet new and interesting people. Though that last one may have varying definitions for some people out there. But honestly, I've met some really cool people, and even a handful of celebrities while serving drinks, and I dig it. Of course, you have the occasional crappy patron, and sometimes you have to deal with fights. But most bars and clubs hire the big muscle guys to take care of those problems. So, you just have to be smart enough not to get involved and to inform security if things get out of hand. The bar I work at has a small radio system for the employees of the club. Basically, it's a walkie-talkie system that allows us to contact each other without having to leave our stations. If I have a customer wanting to know where their deep-fried cheese curds are, I can grab the radio and ask the kitchen for an estimated time of arrival. If we have a band playing, I can radio over to the booth and let them know what it sounds like from my side. On top of this, if we have a customer or patron that is out on the floor and looks like they're getting too hammered, I can call out to security and the other bartenders and inform them that the guy with the skull shirt and blue jeans is cut off, and we can all act as a unit behind the counter. It's probably one of the best things that this club has implemented if you ask me. And the story that I want to tell you is one where this radio really held up its end and made our jobs easier, and potentially saved someone from a horrible situation. This was several years ago. It was a pretty typical night. I think there was some DJ playing a dance set for the bar, and quite a few patrons were out that night. Whenever we have DJs, we usually get a bunch of couples out wanting to get wasted and have fun, first dates, and for some reason, a lot of middle-aged women that get super loud. The people that were involved in this were probably in the first or second category, but it was a group with 2 guys and 2 ladies. One of the couples walked up to the bar. The young lady ordered, I think, a strawberry daiquiri, and he ordered a couple of shots for their friends over on the other side of the room. She pulls out her credit card and asks me to start a tab for them. I grab it and ask for her ID, all the basic stuff, and she checks out and all goes as expected. He tells her to take them over to the friends so they don't have to walk over, and she excitedly agrees. As soon as she walks away, he looks me dead in the eyes and drops a small baggie on the counter, then says, "How much to add this into her drink?" I was clearly taken aback by the fact that he would ask. Then he drops a couple of $100 on the counter and nods toward the baggie. Obviously, I wasn't going to add this into her drink, and I was ready to knock his ass hat out myself, but I grab the bag and the money and tell him to take the rest of the shots over to the friends. He stares at me confused, but then I tell him that he can't be around when I do it, otherwise he'll look guilty. At first, he didn't seem to understand, but after processing it for a few moments, he smirks and nods, then starts to walk towards the group. The second he stepped away from the counter, I grabbed my radio and called for security. I literally told them that I had an attempted drugging, and that management needed to call the police, and the security would need to detain him, and gave his description: black short-cut hair, blue-colored button-down, and khakis. And as soon as they both confirmed that they were all doing what was requested, I stepped out from behind the bar and walked up to the group, then got their attention. At first, the guy seemed a bit suspicious of me, but I calmed his suspicion when I said to the whole group, "Your drinks are coming up shortly, but the system said your card was declined. Any of you other lovely folks have a card for the tab?" I would hate for your party to end here." Then threw a wink over at the jackass. The lady friend pulled out a card and tried to hand it to me. I mentioned that I needed them to come over to the bar so I could get the ID for her card. And then I told the potential victim that she needed to come get her card back. They both followed me over to the counter. The whole time she was saying how confused she was about the card being declined and all of that. But as soon as we got back to the bar and I got to my station, I grabbed the radio and told security to proceed. They approached the two guys, and while I have no idea what was said, I saw that they were motioning toward the door. After a few seconds, the one jackass started yelling about how they weren't going anywhere, and, of course, a small scuffle ensued. When I was certain that security had the two guys under control, I told the two ladies about what the one had asked me to do. I informed them that he had tried to slip me $200 to get me to drug her daiquiri. At first, I didn't think they believed me, but I showed her the baggie and the money and told her that the police were on their way. I think the realization of the situation hit her right then, because she started to cry and her friend was just sitting there with her, mouth wide open. I tried to interject a bit in the attempt to get them talking and calming down. I asked how long they'd known the guys, and she tells me that they had just started dating 2 weeks ago, and that he was a friend of the second guy who turned out to be the female friend's husband. Apparently, she'd known him for years, but the two of them had just started dating because the couple had hooked them up. The cops showed up and pulled the ladies aside to discuss with them, and one of the officers asked me for what the guy gave me. I had no issue with handing it to him, and I told him that the manager would happily give them the security camera footage from behind the bar. Then, they informed me that when they got here, the husband actually tried to fight off one of the officers and claimed that he had no idea what his friend was doing, or he had the drugs on him. Apparently, his friend then literally said in front of the police, "Bullshit, Dave. I literally bought it from you." So, I have no idea what happened to that marriage or that friendship, but I was beyond grateful for the radio system that night. This was one of those situations that makes you think that even if you do know someone, you may not know their intentions. This story happened about a year ago when I was a bartender up in the northeast part of the US. I'm not going to give a specific location for privacy reasons. Just know that it was a fairly decent part of the country and a fairly decent part of the state. The bar itself wasn't one of those snooty high-class joints where people dress in shiny clothing to go to, but it did have standards, in that people were expected to act civilized and know when to cut themselves off. There was the occasional patron that would drink too much and try to start fights, but our door guy was good at his job and we were pretty damn close to a police station. My point is, if they got out of hand, it wasn't long before we had them under control. I think that's why the bar was actually popular, because it was a chill place where you just hung out and played pool. We also had a pinball room that was pretty legit too. Overall, the 6 years I worked there were decent. We didn't have too many problems. But there was one night that I will absolutely never forget for the entirety of my life. I remember that it was a pretty normal Friday night. We were open for the public and there weren't any special events planned. Usually, these nights were the best. We would get a good crowd, decent tips, and you'd meet some pretty cool people that just wanted to have a good night. The entire evening was going pretty normal. Well, until about an hour and a half into the rush crowd. I was sitting there, mixing drinks and handing them out, when I look over to see some random guy walked out of the men's restroom completely naked, with the exception of his shoes. This guy was pushing past people as they stared at him, and he was trying his damnedest to get out of the floor. When he got out to the area by the stage, he started busting his ass in some sort of spasm-filled dance, just absolutely losing it. Remember how I said it was a normal night and no events? That meant there was no DJ, no band, meaning that the only music that was playing was going on overhead, and it wasn't loud, nor was it dance-worthy. But despite that, this guy was flaunting his, manhood all over the dance floor in probably the fastest-paced dance that I'd ever seen. And it would have been absolutely hysterical had I not been working, and had there not been a huge crowd of people trying to enjoy their evenings. When I realized that this guy wasn't going to stop anytime soon, and was probably not doing this in sound mind, I decided to step out and get our security on the situation. I walked over to the door and waved down Bert, the door guy, and explained to him, literally saying the following. "Hey, Bert, there's a naked guy busting a move on the floor to non-existent music, and while I'm happy that he's having a great time, we should probably get him off the floor." I could see Bert laughing as he nodded, and I went back to my bar to finish what I was doing. When I got back over to my station, the manager informed me that he had called the police and that they would be there in only a few minutes. Within a few seconds, I hear a commotion happening, and I assume this guy is giving Bert a hard time. Well, sure enough, I look up and see that Bert is trying to grab the guy's arm and get him off the floor, and this guy is screaming at Bert that he's ruining his night. Bert tells him that he needs to either leave or put his clothes on. And this guy seriously thrashes and decks Bert square in the side of his face. Bert is a big man, and I've never seen him stagger when someone gets aggressive. But this guy apparently had one hell of a right hook, because he was able to knock Bert down. While I wish I could say that he went back to dancing, he didn't. Instead, he made a beeline straight to my bar and started climbing up on it to get away from them, whoever they were. Again, had this not been happening while I was working, I would have been laughing my ass off. But at this point, I didn't really know what to do. After a second or two, Bert got back up and walked up to the bar and basically just tried to talk to this guy down from the top of the bar. After a bit of back and forth between this guy that is clearly tripping hard and Bert, the guy jumps down and tries to run to the back. Thankfully, Bert grabs him and gets him in a lock. But unfortunately for Bert, this guy wasn't done fighting. At this point, this guy is wailing his arms and legs out in any direction he can, and Bert is trying to carry him toward the door. Out of nowhere, this guy goes full psycho and screeches as loud as he can, then literally sinks his teeth into Bert's arm. Like, he literally bit into his arm as hard as he could, to the point that it drew blood and caused Bert to scream in pain. Thankfully at that moment, the police had entered the building and saw what was happening. Though, I don't think it was hard to figure out what the situation was. It took 2 officers and a crap load of blast from the taser to finally get this guy away from Bert and out of the door. Thankfully, due to the fact that this guy was clearly on something, they also sent the paramedics. If you're curious, I believe it was bath salts and speed, so this guy was higher than a Zeppelin. The medics came in and checked Bert's arm out. He ended up needing a few stitches and has a permanent scar on his arm from the guy. Honestly, I'm just glad that Bert was there and was as tough as a guy as he was, because I have this feeling that if I had tried to stop this guy, he would have killed me. We ended up closing for the night after that whole thing went down, and the manager actually hired a second doorman for every shift. I guess he figured that having two burly guys would be better than just the one. And while that was true, we never had another event like that, thankfully. I used to be a bartender for some trashy dive in the middle of nowhere, Missouri. It was a job that I took because I was in need of money and wasn't the smartest kid out there. Not saying bartenders are stupid or anything like that. What I'm saying is that this bar would hire anyone that knew how to use a shot glass. Basically, if you could hold a glass bottle and pour it into the little cup, you could have a job. One would think that the fancy drinks may require a bit more dexterity or understanding. And you'd be right, but this bar was in a part of the town where no one orders drinks with color that wasn't caramel. I think that pretty well explains the place as well as the clientele. Truckers, bikers, some tweakers, the best of the best. But hey, at least we had live music sometimes. I worked at this bar for a few years actually, and mostly because the money was enough to pay my rent. To tell you when I worked there was at that time before Lyft or Uber, back when you had to actually have the number of a taxi company. You had to call them to get someone out, and then they would send the little yellow car to come get you, or whomever. Most of the people that came into our bar would get what they wanted, drink, and then get out. Most of them could take care of themselves, whatever that meant to them, be it a designated driver or just self-control. However, we also had a good number of people that would come in, get completely trashed, and we would have to take care to make sure that they didn't get into a car. Strangely enough, this wasn't actually that hard. We would tell them that they would have to give up their car key to get more to drink, and most people were there to drink too much, so they would then hand me the key and then move on. Then, as stated earlier, when they were done drinking, we would get them a cab and get them home, or somewhere. I hate to be this guy, but after they left the bar and got into the taxi, it wasn't my problem anymore. This situation is one of those times where the events took place, and while there was nothing I could have done, I kinda wish I could have. That specific night was fairly busy. We had a group of bikers that had come in to have a night together, which usually meant that things would be a bit more calm. It's funny how having 10 or 15 burly guys in leather sitting around the bar makes other people behave. And because of this group, I was spending a lot of time and effort taking care of them and also their request, which is fine. But when you're one of two people working the bar, you have to try and balance the handful of other people with a large group. Of course, the large group were also great tippers, and that kind of made me lean into their needs a bit more. I know, a selfish reasoning, but it is what it is. We had a few people leave after only one drink, probably because they were annoyed. But there was one guy that was sitting in the corner and was just kind of staring off into nothing, like he was just spacing out. As a bartender, you have to make sure your customers at least feel welcome in the establishment. So, I went over to his table at one point and asked if I could get him another drink as his glass was empty. He kind of stared at me for a second and then smiled, then shook his head. I could tell that something was up with him, so I paused and decided to go ahead and talk to him for a moment, asking if he was all right. At first, he seemed like he wanted me to go away, but I dropped the line that always seemed to work on people like that. Hey man, I get paid by the hour, and a couple of drinks is a hell of a lot cheaper than a therapist, so if you need to get something off your chest, now is a good time to do so. It seemed like it got through to him. He nodded and kind of grinned before he started talking. Well, man, I'm gonna be honest. Today was probably the worst day that I could have had in a very long time. I was actually fired from my job for the last 9 years today because I made a single mistake that cost the company a couple of grand. I was used to hearing the "I got fired today" kind of stories, and I could tell that this guy was stuck in his own head and needed someone to talk to. So I pulled a chair and decided to sit and listen for a moment. I told him to keep going. The talking it through would help him in the long run. He laughed a bit and then he kept talking. It was a really stupid moment. I messed up and my boss had to fire me. He had no choice. And now I'm sitting here spending what little money I had trying to feel a little more numb than I was already, so that I can go home and tell my girlfriend that I don't have a job anymore. I could tell that this was really hurting him at this point. You know that look people get when they want to break down but are holding it back? That was the exact look that this guy had. I asked him what he was drinking, and he told me that he couldn't really afford another one at that moment. I told him that it was on me in celebration. He kind of stared at me for a moment and I told him that it was to celebrate the future, because while that situation sucked, things would get better, and it was better to believe that the future was worth celebrating than to wallow in the pain of the moment. A side note, yes, being a bartender made me a philosophical person, and I was damn good at it. I then told him that even if he was struggling at the moment, he wouldn't just be broke forever. And I told him to just remember me when he became a millionaire, unless it was from robbing a bank, in which case we've never met. If nothing else, I got a bit of a chuckle out of him, and that was all that I needed. He smirked and told me that he had a Jack and a Coke. I told him that I'd get him a new one. I went back to the bar and did so. He thanked me and told me that he would remember that in the future. I told him no problem and told him to try and have a good evening. He nodded and I went back to my bar, taking care of the bikers and the handful of other people that came in. After about 20 minutes, I looked over and he had left. I cleared and wiped down the table and I kind of moved on from there. And that was until about 10 minutes later. I was clearing out a couple of tabs when the doorman ran in and told me to call the cops. I asked what was up, and he told me that someone had just robbed the convenience store across the road. Obviously, I grabbed the cordless and rang 911, explaining what just happened. They told me that there was a unit that was pulling up to the location and that they were likely going to ask some questions. I told them that it was fine, and then as the officer pulled up, they advised that we could disconnect. Long story short, the officers arrested the guy, and they came over and asked us a few questions. After asking us about what we saw and talking to us about the event, we came to find out that the guy that robbed the store was the guy that had gotten fired. For whatever reason, he left the bar, went over to the convenience store, and apparently he held it up, demanding the money from the store. When the cashier fought him, he took a knife out and stabbed the cashier several times. What's even worse, that wasn't the first place he had robbed that evening, and our bar was actually on his original list. When he saw the bikers, he decided it wasn't worth it. The whole story about being fired was a lie, and the reason he was distraught was because his plan had been foiled by a group of bikers. So, in the end, the guy that I was nice to would have shoved a knife to my face to rip some cash from the register had we not had a bunch of bikers in the place. And my judge of character was apparently way off on this guy. If anyone's curious, the clerk at the store survived, and the guy went to prison for a very long time. I worked at the bar for a few more years, but after that night, I was actually rather elated every single time that the biker group came in. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce from my then husband, full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seemed to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out to me after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case because of some experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of regarding my ex's behavior out at networking events. After this initial call, he started calling on a semi-regular basis to make sure I was okay. This wasn't someone I knew well prior to the separation, and he was much older than I was, but he claimed to have experience with divorce and custody, and I figured that it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him, since his testimony was important per my lawyer. I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day that my son was very sick, and when I told him that I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that, he was dropping by the house uninvited, or he would stop by with cookies for my son and etc. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce is coming soon, so I don't want to make this guy mad. He had called me out of the blue, and I was worried at this point that I was walking a very fine line between polite but clearly not interested, and that if he got mad, he might decide to go testify for my ex and say who knows what. During this time, he had also helped me set up a security cam system that my dad had mailed me, and at one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it. He used and returned a spare key the same day, and one evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted on sticking around to help, even though I was having my starting over catharsis and I wanted to do it alone. Just after the painting day, he came around, uninvited and unannounced, with the magazine photos of Decker, and started carrying on in this manic way about how we could finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls, and I took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid a drop-in. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he would have gotten the hint, and it was a quiet day. The following morning, I took my son on an outing, something like a zoo, and we both came back hot and tired. I put my kiddo down for a nap in my bed, and I decided to close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize that something was way off. As I'm blinking off to sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on my bedside table that I mostly definitely had not put there. There was a post-it note on it, something about planting it in the yard. I started shaking immediately because I recognized the handwriting and stood up to go splash some water on my face and decide whether to call my parents or the police. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized that the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended as like love notes or with affection, but which all scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how these notes could possibly have gotten into my house. My front door was definitely locked. But as I went from room to room, there were notes everywhere. And I mean hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinet. There were even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing all of them and putting them into a pile. and when I got to one in the kitchen, that made my blood run cold. It said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." And I realized that there was a security camera pointed right where the note was left. The one that he had helped me set up for months earlier when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, sent them a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted that I should not call the police. Remember the custody battle? But that he would drive over and change the locks and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the passwords on the security cameras. We had installed this to document if my ex tried to break into the house, so there was one on the front porch, but 3 inside the house, including one in my bedroom. This man could apparently see and hear everything going on inside my house for the past months. The security cameras, I realized, he had just paid attention to my passwords when I was setting up the system. But the only way that I can figure out that he got into my house is that he must have made a copy of my house key the day he had it. And because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me. I was absolutely horrified. This man had been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put that many notes up quickly. And he was right next to my face and feet from my son while we were sleeping, and somehow thought that it was okay. I left and stayed with my parents again for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. And when I came home, my son had gone to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone and on the phone with another friend from out of town. At about 10 p.m., this man showed up at the door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left, which what felt like an hour later. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I am sure he had been drinking. After that, there were several other times someone would start knocking on the door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. I think he was crazy, but not that crazy, and I figured that if I called the police, he would get in more trouble if my son was there. But he knew the schedule, so I know it was him. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered that he had friended my mom on Facebook and was therefore still able to see all the photos of us that she posted or shared. And there was a huge argument when I saw, because she had left her computer logged in, a conversation that they were having about me and how it could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, and I'm still finding new notes even as I was packing. And I am more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I don't post photos of my new house online. Well, not the front anyway. And I have changed the privacy settings on my social media accounts. I avoid all the places he used to go, the networking events he attends, and I stay as under the radar as possible. I could never bring myself to play back the security camera videos because I was traumatized enough, and I didn't want to see how much danger we could have been in. Hopefully, he never sees this post, but you know who you are, and I hope our paths don't cross again. So I was on my way home from Arby's with a mint chocolate shake. I zoned out for a second, and I almost didn't notice his car. I tried just letting him through, but he insisted that I go on ahead. I didn't think much of it, and I just continued on walking. He drove on ahead and parked his car near some apartments. He had on a black polo shirt, so I assumed he was just dropping something off for a job or something. And as I kept walking, he approached me and offered a $20 bill. I asked why, but I couldn't understand what he said in response, and I refused since I know what's best for me. However, that didn't deter him. He grabbed my waist and I stepped to the side. He then started pulling me towards his car. I bit his hand so he wouldn't silence me, and I made sure to scream as loud as possible to try and attract any bystanders if I could. He managed to get me into his car, and just before he could close it, I stuck my foot through the door to keep it open. I then got out and made myself go limp, since adding dead weight without warning creates sudden resistance and makes it harder for them to grasp you. Due to this quick thinking, I was able to get away unharmed. I quickly booked it and then got on the phone with my mom once I was at a safe distance. I made sure to stay on the phone until I got back. After that, I'd taken some time to calm down and then waited for the cops to get there to get my statement. The officer ended up praising my quick thinking, telling me that I'd luckily done everything right in this situation. Please, guys, take self-defense seriously. I've only ever had a week-long course, and just that alone had managed to save my life. I didn't remember too much from my self-defense course and only used the basic techniques that I'd remembered, which was making noise, dropping my weight, and checking behind me. Any other actions I'd taken were a result of logic and quick thinking. Chances are, if I'd gotten more self-defense training, it likely would have been as close of a call as it was. Also, never accept money from strangers. While there are good Samaritans, there's also people who don't have your best interest in mind. If you do think they have good intentions, make sure to double check by asking why they're offering you money. If you don't get a good legitimate reason, then make sure you refuse. And if you refuse and they still persist, get away immediately. This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at that time, and I had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and my 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio. We were surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m., so I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister to see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock, and it was around 2:30 a.m. My brother told me that there were 2 men at our front door. Now, this really woke me up. We quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side, out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me that there were 2 guys who had been talking to each other and also knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and I grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure they weren't at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it is in direct view of the door. My brother was right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to try and find out what was going on. My parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and had come out to find these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, the men returned and began knocking again. despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time, in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards, and still knocking with the dog barking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away, and we all shuffled across the kitchen into the family room to peek outside the windows into our driveway, which is lit up by our outside light. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately the question was, where did the guys go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. They were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which enters into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David!" to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then two things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot this man. And secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared again, only to return to their knocking at the front. However, at this point, several minutes had gone by, and suddenly we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the two men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house, across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. Well, he didn't, and he was immediately tased and then fell onto the ground. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came out the front. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appears that both of them were drunk or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. And while they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, the whole experience wasn't fun. So, random man at our door in the middle of the night, let's not meet again.
I have quite a few horror stories from when I was a front desk attendant for a hotel, but most of them take place when I worked the overnights for the same location. I have a lot of experiences with genuinely creepy and weird people, but I think it would be more fun to share one of the experiences that was a bit more unexplainable and less just this was one creepy guy. So, as I mentioned, I worked as the overnight front desk attendant for this hotel for a couple of years actually. The schedule kind of sucked, and I had to really work to adjust my sleep schedule, and it made days off incredibly difficult. But the pay was decent for the time, and I didn't have much going for me in my life beyond working there. The nights typically consisted of sitting at the front desk for hours, dealing with the one or two people that would show up in the middle of the night because they spent too much time on the road, and sometimes taking things up to rooms if there was an issue or emergency. Beyond that, I would sit at the desk and pretty much just file out the paperwork that had to be done each night. This story I want to share happened during my first year there. I don't recall the time of year, but I think it was in the early winter. The whole thing started when I got a call from the third floor of the building. It was a guest that had checked in at the beginning of my shift, and when I checked him in, he seemed like a pretty decent person. He seemed sane, stable, and polite enough. And I know it sounds weird that I'm saying this, but I'm saying this to demonstrate that he probably wasn't crazy. Anyways, he called down and asked if I could come help him, and he asked me if there was anything I could do about the temperature of the room. I mentioned there was a thermostat in the room, and that most of them were set to a pretty standard temperature, something like 73. He then said that it was set to 73, but the room was feeling cold by the door, like there was a draft coming in from the hallway. That was kind of weird since his room was literally in the middle of the hallway, so he was nowhere near any draft-causing spots like windows or exits. I told him I would come up and check it out shortly. After I hung up the phone, I went ahead and placed the "Be Right Back" sign on the desk and went up to the 3rd floor to see what was going on. When I got up there, I was a bit annoyed. The floor was a pretty standard temperature, but then I walked towards his room and noticed that this guy wasn't lying. As soon as I approached his door, it felt like the hallway went from this nice ambient temperature to about 20 degrees or so colder. We weren't booked full. There was only one other guest staying in a room near him, and their door didn't feel cold, so they didn't have the AC on or anything. But for some reason, the closer I got to his door, the colder it felt. I knocked on his door to let him know that I at least felt what he was talking about. When he answered, I told him that he was definitely correct. It was colder, but that I couldn't figure out what it was as there weren't any drafts, and there was nothing that should have been causing the colder temps. I then asked him if he wanted to move to another room, and after a bit of contemplating, he said that he would. We went through the whole process. I got him in another room down the hall, closer to the elevator, and apologized for the inconvenience. He seemed satisfied with my resolution, so we moved on, and I thought that was the end of it. Except about 20 minutes later, he called down to the front desk again. This time, he was a lot less happy. He started going off about how someone had knocked on his door multiple times, but then when he went to answer it, there was no one there. This was a really weird thing to have happening, mostly because, like I mentioned, there was only one other person near him, and that person was an older gentleman that looked like he was there for business, not the type to knock and run. I pulled up the camera system to check if I could see his door, and sure enough, I could. I asked him when the last time it happened was, and he started telling me that it started happening almost right away as soon as he got settled into his new room, and that had been happening every few minutes. He said that each time it happened, there would be no one on the other side of the door, so he assumed that they were knocking and running away. He then said that he had walked around the hallways and not seen anyone. As soon as he finished explaining this, I heard, clear as day, 3 very aggressive knocks on the door of his room come through the phone. He then got up and angrily said, "See, there's that SOB again." The problem was that I was staring at his door from the camera. There was no one there. I even kind of said that under my breath, and at first I don't think he understood what I said, because he said, "Right, because they knock and run away." I then reiterated my statement saying, "No, sir, I'm looking at your door from the camera, and there is no one there. As in, no one came to your door and knocked at all." He paused for a moment, but came back with a much less angry, much more confused tone, saying, "But you heard the knocking, right?" I told him that I did hear it, but said that at no point in time did anyone come to his door. Pretty much right away, we heard another very loud knock on the door, and he started saying, "Is there anyone there now?" To which I said no. I could tell that he was starting to freak out, and to be honest, I was as well. Between the weird drop in temperature around his old room, and now the phantom knocking, it seemed like some sort of spirit or ghost was following and messing with this guy. I know it was just 2 isolated incidents, but they were bizarre and were not things that we'd ever had reported. The knocking was definitely more terrifying than the cold spot, but both kind of had me leaning into supernatural territory. After a few seconds of silence, I offered to move him to one of the expensive rooms on another floor, basically upgrading him for free because of this. He did agree, and when he came down to the front desk, he was pretty pale and obviously freaking out. I asked if he was okay or if something else happened, and he told me that as he left his room with his stuff, he started hearing something laughing. I kind of passed over his comment and told him that we would get him taken care of. I got him in one of our most expensive rooms, which was not on the 3rd floor, and told him that if there were any more issues, I would go ahead with a full refund. He nodded and just slowly stepped back to the elevator with zero energy in his step. A few things to wrap the story up. First thing first, he did not have any more issues. When he checked out in the morning, I was told that he wanted to give praise to my manager for my handling of his issues, basically saying that I went above and beyond for him. And to anyone that will say that he was faking the issues or doing something to cause them, I'm going to say that I highly doubt it. The cold spot issue, I guess he could have had the AC on in the room, but that would be kind of dumb to do if I was coming up to see why it was so cold. Plus, it felt like it was more in the hallway than coming from his room. The knocking thing, I'm certain wasn't his doing. After I got him in the 3rd room, I actually went back and watched the camera footage, and unless he was so committed to the bit that he opened his door and looked around confused each time, and then left to walk around the hallway, and then angrily threw the door open for the act, all without knowing I could see him on camera, then I'm pretty certain it was real. On top of that, after he left his room, I saw him start to walk down the hallway and then pause to look back and around for what I'm assuming was the laughing. I watched the color drain from his face on that footage, and there's no real way to fake fear that intense. Also, this was the only complaint that I ever received about all this, which makes me seriously think that whatever this was directly attached to him. In the end, it was a super weird and genuinely creepy situation, and I felt bad for the guy. By the time he got into the new room, it was already past midnight, and I'm concerned he didn't sleep very well. I hope that this thing wasn't attached and was just messing with him for some reason, and I hope that he made it wherever he was going safely. And I'm also very sorry that your stay at our hotel was so eventful.
Starbucks is my favorite place to get coffee. Part of my morning ritual is to go there, get my coffee, and then go about my day. Unlike most of the population, I'm addicted to coffee. I'm not the friendliest person to talk to in the morning, and I can be standoffish. When my name was called out, and naturally it was spelled incorrectly, I had to squeeze past several men to get there. I tried doing the polite, "Excuse me," while I tried to move past, and one of the men didn't move. I gestured with my hand that I needed to make my way through. He moved, but just enough for me to get by and for me to rub against him. I cringed as I did so. He leaned in close, sniffed my hair, and made a creepy purr sound in my ear. I was completely repulsed by it. I grabbed my drink and made my way out as quickly as possible. I sipped and smiled at the flavor, when I heard a creepy voice in my ear. "I have something else you can taste." It was the same creeper from before. His breath smelled disgusting, and I pulled away from him, It was crowded and I don't think anyone heard what he said above the noise of the cafe. I stared at him in disgust and he leaned forward and winked at me. I pushed past him and made it out of the Starbucks. I was angry at this point, but I didn't want one idiot to ruin my day. But it was when I noticed that he was following me, and at first, I didn't worry about it too much. It was a busy street, and he could have been heading to wherever he had been heading. But about 5 minutes, I wanted to do a test and see if I was being paranoid about it. I turned into a street in the opposite direction of my school. The only other buildings was a small corner store and a beautician. 2 places that I didn't think he would go. But he kept following me. I was starting to get so worried now, I wanted to run away screaming. But instead, I went into the beautician's and pretended like I was looking at the prices. He was waiting outside. I leaned forward and I whispered to one of the women that he was following me and I was worried. At first, I don't think she believed me since he hadn't done anything yet. I waited there for 10 minutes and he was still waiting outside for me. She went outside and asked what the problem was. He didn't answer and just walked away. After I saw he left, I hurried to get to school and kept looking behind me to see if he was there. He wasn't. And every time I've gone to Starbucks, he hasn't been there. And I hope that I don't run into him again. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate each and every one of you. But I would also like to thank my amazing patrons, my top tippers, and my dearest channel members. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it with all of my heart. If you want to support the channel further, you could also choose to become a patron, a tipper, or a channel member. But remember, it's appreciated, but never a requirement. I would also like to announce that we have merch now. The link is in the description of the video, along with all my other social media links, like my Discord server, Twitter, Instagram, and others. You can connect with me and send your stories there. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, and comments are highly appreciated. And remember, your fear feeds me.